I think, one of the most iconic trees found on Long Island, and that's Atlantic white cedar. And it's a tree that's, at first blush, not diverse at all. You might just be familiar with it as a typically tall, columnar evergreen that it grows in these kind of even-age stands, most notably out in the pine barrens. But if you look at the species a little more carefully, you see that it may be actually a little bit more diverse than that. And there's a population of white cedars in Sears Bellows County Park, for example, that really merits greater attention, because it may in fact be something distinct, genetically distinct, something different in terms of being a dwarf cedar forest. And there is such noted examples of dwarf cedar forests, I know, from at least coastal Rhode Island, by some community ecologists that have studied them up there. So what I'd like to do is just go through the, as the lecture indicates, really the historical and current status of this species on Long Island. I'm sorry, getting you away so you can see. So some basic facts. Most people are surprised to know that actually white cedar is a little bit misnamed. It's not a member of the cedar family. Red cedar is, but white cedar is not. It's a member of the cypress family. It can grow really pretty tall. And again, if those of you that are familiar doing some field work and seeing white cedars, they often can get to be 40, 50, 60 feet in height if given the opportunity. And they've got a very distinctive kind of foliage to them in terms of the flattened sprays, small scale-like leaves that are typically laterally flattened, providing kind of a fan-like aspect to them. For a tree so big, you would think, if you're familiar with, of course, pitch pines, and you know the size of pitch pine cones, or of course white pine, the large cones, you would think if white cedar, being a tall tree, would also have similarly large cones. And I remember when years ago, many years ago, first saw white cedar, I was surprised at how small the cones are. The cones are really about the size of your pinky fingernail, and that's about in size, and you can see them here. Interesting fact here, seeds are tiny. It takes about 460,000 seeds to make a pound. I actually found that in a report, a USDA agriculture report that came out in the 1930s, that some probably graduate student was stuck having to do this to count, to make up of that, that number. That tells you that these seeds are tiny, and that has implications in terms of both distribution and dispersal of this particular tree. White cedar seeds are really, really, really small. They've got these little flattened wings on each side and can be easily dispersed by the wind. Well, what is the distribution of Atlantic white cedar? Well, it's suggested in its name. It is a tree that really grows along the coastal plain, along the Atlantic seaboard. From coastal Maine, there's a few known populations, and then as you head south, it becomes more extensive through several dozen locations in southeastern and eastern Massachusetts, through southern Rhode Island and Connecticut, and then of course Long Island, a few populations in mainland New York, and then the white cedar doesn't really become extensive to the extent you start getting swamps of hundreds of acres in size until you really hit the Jersey pine lands, and then further south, the real stronghold for white cedar is for Dismal Swamp on down through North Carolina, South Carolina. It does go all the way over to, you can see it along the Gulf Coast. I have read some reports about actually white cedar going all the way over to Texas, extreme eastern Texas. So you can say, originally it thought to encompass about 500,000 acres in size, but through habitat modification, destruction, it's significantly smaller in extent than it was historically. Just to give you just a view of, here's a white cedar stand in New Hampshire. In that state, they've documented their heritage program. They're documented 30 different stands. And what's kind of interesting to note is that white cedar, the floral components of cedar swamps, if you will, or the other plant species that will associate with white cedar, as you might guess, going from this far north all the way down to the humid Gulf Coast is going to markedly change. And that, in fact, is the case. There are many, many hundreds of species of plants that differ, that are found in different white cedar swamp communities as you go north-south or south-north. So this is just a view of the white cedar stand in New Hampshire that you can take a look at. Focusing now, getting into New York, and we're going to focus on Long Island in a second. The plant in New York, as again the name indicates, is really restricted to the coastal plain pretty much. And you've got populations in both Nassau and Suffolk County, as well as in the lower Hudson River Valley. And I think the innermost population is really up in Sterling Forest, if you're familiar. A very popular place to go bird watching, but there is a population of Atlantic white cedar inland, and I think that's the most, again, inland population in New York, and one of the most inland populations entirely. It's just really restricted to the coast. Well, the New York Natural Heritage Program has identified actually 2 different cedar communities. Again, the top one, number 1, being much rarer of the 2, the inland Atlantic white cedar swamp. And again, a conifer mixed swamp that occurs on organic soils in poorly drained depressions and along pond edges in southeastern New York and northern New Jersey. And the other point I meant to say before, I talked a little bit about that white cedar being a little more diverse than you might think, is that it really does grow in different kind of habitats. The common link, of course, is really going to be water and soil moisture, but there are a variety of different kind of wetland habitats that you can find white cedar growing in. Probably most people, to the extent that you think about white cedar, seen it, will think about or know about. Usually they have a stand growing in extensive peat beds. And there are some wonderful examples of that on Long Island, most notably one in western Southampton town around Big Fresh Pond, or near Big Fresh Pond. But white cedar will grow along streams, along river banks, and I'll be showing you a number of slides of some of those in a second. So anyway, they've identified these 2 different cedar communities, and the coastal plain Atlantic white cedar swamp is the one that is found on Long Island. And again, I don't know if you can see some of the species from where you are in terms of reading it, but not surprisingly, you do have some other codominants that, like red maple, of course, tupelo, pitch pine, that will grow in association with white cedar or other trees. Then you got a whole bunch of shrubs like inkberry and highbush blueberry, sweet pepper bush. And then there's a whole group of characteristic herbs or forbs that grow beneath that, most notably, to my experience, at least cinnamon fern, probably more than anything else. But in some places like at Quogue, you do find pitcher plants in close association with them as well. Going through the early literature, it's kind of neat to read about some of the early work. And John Torrey's 1843, A Flora of Long Island. I don't know if you can quite see what it says. It says sphagnous swamps, Long Island, where in several places, as near Rockaway, Hempstead, Babylon, Islip, it occurs in considerable quantities. It also makes mention of the population, the inland population up at Peach Pond in Putnam County. And so as early as 1843, there was documentation about how extensive the white cedar was in New York State, and kind of a bit about its distribution. The New York State Museum, their herbarium has got a number of records of white cedar taken from, specimens taken from Long Island. It's also populations, of course, in the New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanical Garden that have specimens as well. And I didn't quite make it out where you are, but here's Plum Island. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. And that Plum Island specimen was collected by Roy Latham, the very great and famous naturalist from the North Fork, and then other populations at Rockaway, Hempstead, Babylon, Rockville Center. This was a very significant, large population at one time, historic population of white cedar. And then interestingly, it looks like 1920, sometime in the 20s, populations that were taken from the Nissaquag, Suffolk County. And we're going to show you that population in Nissaquag in just in a little while. A historical distribution is from a map, an old historical map that shows, again, Atlantic white cedar. And not surprisingly, as I've already said numerous times, it really was, was really most noted on Long Island. And you can see the populations along the south shore of the island. Here's the populations that were in the Nisququag River system. Another one, Cold Spring Harbor, it looks like Cold Spring Harbor area. One or two interesting kind of notes about its distribution is that we do not know. I should point out that actually Eric Lamont and I have been involved in trying to document every known occurrence of Atlantic white cedar on Long Island, where we're slowly working towards a paper that we're going to submit to REA that talks about, again, the historic and current distribution of white cedar. And so we've been painstakingly going around and trying to document every known occurrence. The occurrence being, it could be just as little as just one tree remaining, and there are some examples of that, unfortunately. But some of these are kind of an enigma to us. This population here in the middle of Brookhaven, don't know where that is. If that looks like it was in the headwaters, probably along the Carmen's River, but at this scale, it's just really impossible to tell. We do not know of any, I don't know of any white cedar populations historically, with that exception, or certainly currently in the entire town of Brookhaven.
What's the date of this map?
I've forgotten. I meant to put that in. It's
we had planted Atlantic white cedar
in the
on site.
Okay. Well, that looks. Could that be? That might be B&L.
It could be.
Yeah. From the vegetation of Connecticut in 1913, they had this to say about, and actually I think you can barely make out these little dots that show the distribution of Atlantic white cedar. It's kind of a stronghold out in the eastern reaches of the kind of Peconic River system. But it will be seen that there is an almost continuous chain of them extending to the length of Long Island. And again, highlighting the kind of strongholds, historic strongholds of Atlantic white cedar were along almost every south the shore flowing stream seem to have populations of varying sizes, some very large, involving thousands to tens of thousands of trees, others that were smaller in size. And then again, the other main population area kind of out in the Pine Barrens. And not surprisingly, it's this area that is the stronghold for the species to this day. Roland Harper in 1907 wrote about a Long Island cedar swamp, and this is the one that's was located in Merrick, and I'm going to get to that in a second. And it was a very, very, again, extensive swamp that involved, again, at least thousands of trees. That is unfortunately a place that has been almost entirely altered / destroyed, and today, while the stream itself and some adjacent kind of bracketed wetlands and forest exists, there is no white cedar there. And again, I'll get to that in just a minute. I'm going to take you through pretty much all the different places that we went to. Again, Eugene Bicknell wrote about the distribution of white cedar in western Long Island. This plant was known again in New York City, in Queens and in Brooklyn. In fact, the very headwaters of Newtown Creek, there apparently was a rather large or extensive white cedar swamp back in several centuries ago. Kind of hard to envision that today if you drive around Newtown Creek now, but at one time that was indeed the case. Emily Latterman did extensive, actually a book on the distribution of Atlantic white cedar. Well, I actually should say that was one chapter in the book, and focusing on New York, and it's kind of hard, it doesn't really read well, but she highlights some of the records from Suffolk County. So I make this point simply if you become interested in white cedar or already are, there is a fair amount of historical literature that you can read about this species on Long Island. So now I'm going to take you on a inventory. You're going to sprout wings, and we're going to take you up above Long Island and show you some of the known populations from this work that Eric and I have been undertaking. Tiffany Creek Preserve, this is actually good news. This was an open space property that the park now acquired in Nassau County. Nassau County has not been all that active in buying open space, but fortunately back in the, I think it was the late 80s, with the assistance of the Nature Conservancy, the county did buy this rather large several hundred acre tract, and in the extreme eastern end of it is this small Atlantic white cedar grove at the headwaters of this dammed system, which is Tiffany Creek. And you go there and you can see that there are about 24 trees in the canopy overstory. And I thought I put some photos. No, I didn't. There is some recruitment. There is some reproduction that's taking place, which is good. So you can go there and you can see little baby white cedars that are growing up. I don't think you can see in this photo, quite tickle it out, but I do remember just to the left of this photo and near me were some white cedars that were about 5 or 6 feet high. So again, there is some recruitment and there is some regeneration that's going on there. So that's one of the 2 known populations of Atlantic white cedar that still really remain in Nassau County. Another population that did exist, the population consisting of 2 trees, was at the Freeport Brookside Preserve, which is, I think, managed by the South Shore Audubon Society in cooperation with Nassau County. And there actually were, you can see the trees that were here. They are no longer there. One was cut down by vandals, and the other actually blew over in a storm. So this population within the last 10 years has, as they say, winked out. It's been extirpated. So it's gone, unfortunately. But and I went there on, you can see, on August 9th, 2011 to try to find the status of that, learn the status of it. That's what I found. And speaking with some folks from South Shore Audubon, they confirmed that it's in fact gone. Here's the preserve that I mentioned that you saw before, Roland Harper talking about the extant white cedar swamps. If you actually go on Bing Maps or Microsoft Maps, the aerial photographs, you can see that. I didn't type that in. That's actually there. It says cedar swamp, and you can see the creek running down through the property. Is actually another a stream system that actually dead ends south of Sunrise. This actually continues north of Sunrise. It's a stream system that's decent birding for waterfowl. But anyway, this was the area here running north that had a very large. You can see the hopefully the name Cedar Swamp here from a USGS topographical map. I think this was a 1954 map, and it had that name. So again, this was a very extensive, thousands upon thousands of white cedar. What really was the factor that seemed to affect it more than anything else was, not surprisingly, the hydrological changes that occurred with the construction of the railroad and Sunrise Highway and Merrick Road. That just really changed things, and the population was lost. Anyway, I went there on the same date, August 9th, 2011, in the hopes of finding some evidence. Did not find anything, pretty preserved, but no evidence of white cedar. I had been to that site about 25 years ago with Bob McGrath, another naturalist you may be familiar with on Long Island. We actually did find some cedar logs up in the northwestern corner, right by the letter E in the preserve. And I went trying to find those. I couldn't even find the logs. No, and I wouldn't have think they're not going to decompose. So I don't know if I just missed them, but we did find this, a few cedar logs back 25 years ago or so. Tacapusha Preserve, some people are more, this is probably the most well-known stand of white cedar in Nassau County, down in the kind of southeastern part of the county in Seaford. And there's a stand of white cedar right here at the kind of the headwaters of this, the stream that flows through. And going there, you can see, again, recruitment, which is good. You can see the young cedars. Of course, if you've ever seen baby cedars, they look like little tiny Christmas trees. They really don't begin developing that kind of that fan-like growth till they're about 3-4 years old. They just change radically. The first and second year cedars are really small and kind of single stemmed, and then they begin to branch out and start growing again, the flattened scales. But you can also see some rather large trees that are still found there at Tacapusha. It is an area that long-term I have concerns about, because the day I was there, and not too far, there was some evidence of teenagers carousing, and they had built some, they had a campfire there. They had a fire, with beer and cans and all that sort of thing. And if that was to have gotten out of control, and it wasn't very far away, it could have easily had some impact. Plus, this area is being trampled a little bit, I think, by people going in there. So it wouldn't take much effort by Nassau County Parks to actually kind of cordon off the area and give, again, these little cedars a chance to grow up and not be trampled. East Massapequa, not too far actually from my home, there's a A population of cedars persisting. This is if anybody remembers the infamous Nautilus Steiner. It's one of my hangouts. They used to call it the Nausea Steiner, but okay, Nautilus. That's right here. And this is Merrick Road. That's heading west that way. Anyway, you can see the East Massapequa Creek. And Bicknell wrote about this in a 1908 article. He talked about that there was a rather large population of white cedar that grew along this stream. And the reason I thought it has to be here is because he actually talks about it being about a half to 3/4 of a mile from southwest of the Amityville train station. And I looked on a map, measured it, and sure enough, it's very likely was this population. We're down to just, again, a handful of trees. You can see one of these trees right in this person's backyard. Again, the long-term prospects for this population is not good at all. It'll probably disappear through time. Moving out into Suffolk County now, if you know Belmont Lake State Park, under the southern section of Belmont Lake State Park, south of Sunrise, you've got Southard's Pond, which is again a good place for winter waterfowl. You can see that there are two particular white cedars that were found. Oh, I thought I had a close-up photo. One, as you can see, survives. The other, actually, Hurricane Irene took it down. I did actually go out after Hurricane Sandy and walked it, and the tree's fine. It's still there. But again, long-term prospects obviously not very good. I have not seen any recruitment. I can see cones, and presumably the tree's producing a lot of seeds, but no evidence of any. For some reason, I'm not sure, because the habitat right there is okay. I couldn't find any young cedars. Connecticut River State Park, where if you drive along Sunrise Highway, please do pay attention as you drive, but if you do look off to your left or right, depending what direction, you will see a stand of Atlantic white cedar, actually in these areas I've marked with the arrow. And then much further north, in a section of Connecticut, above Veterans Highway, between Veterans Highway and then Lakeland County Park, close to the Greenbelt Trail along the main river, there's one tree. These are all pitch pine. And actually, after a while, you get a depth at being able to tell the difference, the slight green difference that distinguishes white cedar from pitch pine. That there's one large Atlantic white cedar survive. Speaking with Gil Bergen, the superintendent of Connecticut, indicated that it was one time was much more common within the again, what is the Southside Sportsman's Club, but a lot of not surprisingly, the trees were harvested because they have great commercial value, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit further on. Here's again the tree. You can see the power line right along Sunrise. Here's again individual white cedars. These are right along the Greenbelt Trail. Hopog Springs, in the town of. Actually, this is, I think, just in the town of Islip, just because I think that maybe the line's there. Or maybe, no, this is Midtown still. There's a population, if you come out of the county center, the light here, waiting to make a left, shall we say, you look across, you'll see there's a nice stand of several dozen Atlantic white cedar. And this is, if any of you heard Mike Bettini talking before about the river otters, this is one of the areas where he's actually spotted, I'm not sure he actually spotted river otters themselves, but evidence of river otters. And so they actually go underneath here. And right over here is very extensive Blydenburg County Park, which is, as you know, part of the whole Nisqually River system. So this is the very headwaters, one of the very headwaters of the Nisqually River, and you've got the white cedars that are found there. And here's just a view again, right off the Vets Highway. Again, you go zipping by this probably many times, and you can see the stand of white cedar. But then Blydenburg County Park. I grew up actually in Smithtown, and I remember hearing about these cedars in the park, but it took a couple years to find out where they were. And it actually is made very easy for you now. If you're familiar with Blydenburg County Park, the Southern Loop, they put probably 15 years ago a nice wooden boardwalk through this area, and so you could now truly walk all around the entire Stump Pond or Blydenburg Pond, whatever than you prefer. Before that, you really couldn't because it's very, very wet in this area. But with that boardwalk, you can now do that. So you can walk, if you do walk that boardwalk, which I encourage you, it's a wonderful place to go hiking. It'll take you right through, right past these very large white cedar population. It's the largest white cedar stand in western Suffolk County, involving, as you can guess, several hundred trees. This is probably 4, 5, 6 acres in size. Kind of neat. And here's just a view. You see some cinnamon fern. I actually went bushwhacking in there to try to get some photos of it. You see some wind tossed. A lot of trees were down through various storm events. But jumping. Now we jump all the way from, we just were in Hauppauge, all the way out to Riverhead. Again, because I don't know of any populations of white cedar that remain anywhere in eastern Islip, eastern Smithtown, and all of Brookhaven town. If anybody, by the way, make the point, if you know of any populations where it's said and done that we've missed, please do bring it to my attention, and we'll go out and check that. Tomorrow, the field trip, for those of you that will be going on the field trip, this Cranberry Bog County Nature Preserve will be one of our first stops. We're going to walk around the pond here and see the white cedars, but there is extensive populations of Atlantic white cedar involving thousands of trees throughout this whole area of the Pine Barrens. This is kind of the little river tributary to the Peconic River, and that's one of the largest and best populations of Atlantic white cedar. A lot of recruitment. There's a lot of young trees growing in the former cranberry bogs, hence the name. This was the largest commercially operating cranberry bog on Long Island, beginning back in the 1872, 1873, and was in business for many, many decades. And since it went out of operation, of course, succession has taken place, and the white cedars have come in, and you can find white cedars of almost any age class in this preserve. Here's just a view of, again, white cedars along different places within the county park. Quag Refuge, there's a few trees scattered in the northern part of kind of the Ice Pond, where Ice Pond kind of ends and becomes, I guess more the creek, Quanta Creek. You'll find small populations of Atlantic white cedar. This is, again, if you know the bridge you cross over, then you go hiking there to the creek. Just again, I think you can just make out the sprays of the white cedar here. Merritt Pond in Riverhead, northeast of the location. There's a hard to visualize a pond, but this is about a 12-acre pond preserved by the town of Riverhead, and there is a extensive stand of Atlantic white cedar, as evidenced by the arrows here, as well as a outlying stand on the other side of Northville Turnpike. This population is not protected in terms of being at least within conservation land. This population is preserved. And again, you can see there's some really rather large white cedars that are found there. And you can actually see a burl here. There's a type of fungus, gymnosporangium fungus, that attacks white cedar. And sometimes you'll see these really neat, kind of almost pretty, but grotesque in a way, burls that grow on the branches. And they're here, and there's again a population down Southampton. I've seen a lot of that fungus growing. Owl Pond County Park, Flanders. There's several hundred trees on the west side of Owl Pond. This is again another large stand. Here's again Route 24, Spinney Road, Hubbard, or again Flanders County Park, depending what name you want to give it. This is all the Maple Swamp area, entire tract now preserved in conservation status. Same thing with this area right down here as part of Sears Bellows County Park. And again, really nice stand of white cedar that grows along the edges of the pond and then back away. Sears Bellows, moving east, over to, again, Sears Pond, Bellows Pond, Division Pond, House Pond. These are very important and extensive stands of white cedar. And then hopping across the road up into Hubbard County Park, you've got Penny Pond. You've got some white cedars that are found in the southeast corner of Petty Pond, and then as along the creek, there's white cedar that grows. In Hubbard County Park, there's actually 4 stream systems that drain the pine barrens that flow out into the bay, and white cedar grows along several of those streams. But you can see the kind of difference here, these almost moated like wetlands of mostly white cedar. And here's the view that you can see. There's actually, you stand on the shore, and then there's 10, 12, 15 feet of typically open water, or maybe there's some lily pads, but then you hit these moated islands of Atlantic white cedar that really seem to be smaller, and based on some evidence in terms of coring, seem to be really very, very slow growing, and may again constitute a kind of a different population. I'm calling it dwarf cedar forest. I'm not sure if that's accurate yet. We have to do more work, but it's something that's certainly worthy of further attention in terms of, do we have some biodiversity there right under our noses that we weren't aware of. Again, this has been identified in the literature, a dwarf cedar forest in several places in Rhode Island, and it's the only place I know where it's been reported. And so, thought is if we actually do have something here at Cirrus Bellows, that would be neat, and we'd like to really try to determine if in fact that's the case. And then I'm trying to think what I wanted to say here about white cedar. Oh, this is the, I'm trying to find this. Oh, sorry. It's actually, you can't read it here, but there's here it is, a highly unusual stand of Atlantic white cedar occupies a kettle situated on an outwash at the edge of Factory Pond in Rhode Island. This is her description of the dwarf cedar forest up in Rhode Island from that same book that I mentioned before. So again, that's been documented in literature by Professor Frank Olay up at the University of Rhode Island, and I've chatted with him years ago about this, and haven't had him come down to Long Island. I'd like to do that and have him take a look at the ones in Cirrus Bellows to determine again if we do have something that's similar. Quickly, South Fork sites. There are several sites on the South Fork that contain Atlantic white cedar. Probably the best are the 3 again near, as I mentioned. Here's Big Fresh Pond, Little Fresh Pond, North Sea Road. Maybe familiar with is you'd head this way, going up like this to head to say the Morton National Wildlife Refuge, make the turn and continue on. These are really extensive white cedar populations, and these are probably the kind of classic example of very tall columnar white cedar growing on very extensive peat beds. There was a researcher from Queens College years ago, Alice Belling, that did some peat coring, and I believe it went down 22 feet before they hit sand underlying it. 22 feet of peat that is found. So these depressions that do hold water are really saturated with a great deal of peat. And again, depending on the conditions, you can see they kind of can dry out, but other times they can be pretty wet. This is all wet right here. Again, mostly large trees, some recruitment that's going on. So these sites are pretty intact. And again, fortunately, most of these have been preserved by the town of Southampton. Moving east out in the Watermill area, there's actually 4 different stands. These were new to me. I did not know about these, but they're reported by a researcher from an environmental analyst from the town of Southampton, brought them to my attention, went out and confirmed them. And they are, except for this one, which consists of several dozen, maybe several score, these are just really scattered of anywhere up to a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half trees, mixed in with red maple and a whole host of other wetland plant species. Some very large ones, particularly in the stand in the southwest. Actually, this stand's got a very large white cedar. Maybe it's one of the 2 largest I've found on the island. And then the Sagaponack site, again, many times you've driven along Montauk Highway. You can actually see these stands if you know when to look. Off to the right, you can see just the tops of the white cedar. You can populate these 3 populations, and they again, you see I have a note here, the largest tree that I've found, there it is, Atlantic white cedar. Haven't cored it, but I'm be curious to know how old it is. White cedar is not, you know, they don't get to be 500, 600, 700 years old. I think typically records 300, 400 years. So it'd be kind of neat to core this, but I guess it's probably within that range. 300 to 400 years old would be maybe a reasonable guess for it. But it's again, you can see that it's again 7 feet 8 inches around, so you can kind of get some sense of just how big a tree it is. This population is not protected. Just south of this is the Nature Conservancy's Sag Swamp Preserve, which you may be familiar with the boardwalk. Very nice. But these three populations are owned by a fairly well-known South Fork farming family, and I don't know what the long-term status is. I mean, obviously they're not, based on law, allowed to destroy the wetlands themselves, but I don't know in terms of the developable upland around and what the future holds. Something that we like to focus on. So anyway, the Sagaponic site's really neat, and if you want to go out there, you could just park along the road, and I've just walked in through this old fallow field, and it's pretty easy to work your way through these three. But this stand is really quite beautiful. If those of you that listened to Matt Schlesinger before when he did the biodiversity of Plum Island, know what I'm going to say here. Here is the area of Plum Island that once had a very extensive stand of Atlantic white cedar. It certainly involved several hundred trees. It is all gone. You can go out there and see the stumps. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was actively cut or some storm event blew them over or what, but you can take a look in Roy Latham's article that was in, I think, Engel Hardy back in 1969. He says the status of the osprey at Orient, and that's interesting, always interesting in ospreys, but for the context of this presentation, it says in 1909, fortifications were built on Plum Island. That was what is now Fort Terry, which is one of the cultural resources that we want to try to protect through our efforts to protect Plum Island. But you can see that it says that the laborers working on that project developed a liking for osprey eggs, the nest situated on the ground in the low trees, as well as in the island's big white cedar swamp. So that was Roy Latham's description about the population of white cedar that occurred on Plum Island. Quickly, you can see some of the species associated with white cedar. I'm not going to go through these all. You can read this on your own. But again, the point I want to make again is what I made before, is that on Long Island, there's really several dozen other woody and non-woody species that you find associated with white cedar growing in different wetland situations. But as you go up and down the coast, that composition changes, quite radically, which is kind of something interesting for a natural community. You don't often experience that or come across examples of that. And this is just a Virginia chain fern, a netted chain fern, one of the common fern species that you'll find growing in white cedar swamps. Not a lot. I don't know a lot about invertebrates that butterflies and other invertebrates that use white cedar. The most famous example I do know about is Hessel's hairstreak, which at one time was a candidate for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. I don't think it ever did get listed, but this is a beautiful little hairstreak butterfly, closely related to the olive hairstreak, which feeds on red cedar, that was, I think, fairly common on Long Island in the white cedar swamps, but based on some work that was done, actually Skip Blanchard, those of you that may remember, was a professor at Cedar Post. Skip did some of the early inventory work that documented the presence of this species, but it has not been seen since 1984. I don't know why, what happened. To result in its extirpation, but I've gone out a few times, the right time of year, to look for this butterfly. It could be flying around in the foliage, but haven't seen it. Not that of course, really is the type of systematic work that needs to be done, but it'd be worthwhile really for somebody to spend some time trying to document that perhaps maybe the species is still hanging on. But again,
I knew Skip, but we used to go out a bit, and I also went out on my own a few times.
No luck?
You know, like Owl Pond.
Right. You have any insight why you think it went out? I don't.
No, I mean, the habitat is pretty much on all good. One of the things I always try to focus on is nectaring plants. So I remember some leather leaf, is that one?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any sandwood in these places, but if you're out looking again, focus on that a little bit rather than just any old standard tree.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot.
They're high up, you're not going to see them, but they come down to nectar, you had a fighting chance.
Well, there is a lot of leatherleaf in Cranberry Bog, and a lot of the sweet pepper bush, which I would expect they might use. Nectaring butterflies. Yeah. But anyway, it's one of the neat species that is dependent upon Atlantic white cedar as a host plant. So just wrapping up some observations and comments. There are apparently no extant populations between Hauppauge and Riverhead, a distance of approximately 35 miles. That includes the entire town of Brookhaven, the entire Carmen's River watershed, and the western part of the Peconic River watershed. No evidence of white cedar. There are no extant populations from Oyster Bay to Quogue along several dozen stream systems located at South Shores in the towns of Babylon, Islip, Brookhaven, except for, again, the populations of Connecticut. And I'm reading this because I'm not sure if you can quite make it out from where you are. There are no extant populations on the North Fork. Again, those early maps did show some populations where Latham had determined or located some populations of white cedar at Laurel Lake, which is now Dam Pond too? Oh, I don't think so. I have to check. But I know Laurel Lake, and there was some further west in Riverhead that he had documented. Fortunately, the overwhelming majority of the population of Atlantic white cedar are on public park or preserved land. And then the question is, should an Atlantic white cedar restoration initiative restoring the species to some of the historical sites be considered or undertaken? And Louise, you're going to take that on, right? Is that something to do? Thank you. That's great. Historical uses, white cedar is used and was used for a whole variety of purposes. Of course, most notably, probably for cedar shakes for houses. And I remember reading when I was in Philadelphia, Independence Hall, and reading about colonial Philadelphia, how so much of colonial Philadelphia, the cedar shakes, came from the Atlantic white cedar swamps of Jersey. And they harvested the cedar out and, of course, transported them not too far. But white cedar was used for a lot of other purposes. It's a fairly light wood. As you know, it's resistant to decay. It's not a really strong wood, so early on was tried to be, because it's so columnar, I thought, well, it could be used for ship masts. It breaks. It's not strong enough really for that purpose. But for fence posts and for other type of posts, it works well, and then wood carving and a whole host of other uses. Small boat building, white cedar was a preferred wood. It's very easily worked, apparently. So it did at one time have great historical importance, and it still does to this day. There's still a fair amount of commercial harvesting of Atlantic white cedar down in North Carolina and South Carolina. There's an industry to this day. Most of the cedar shakes you get now are the cedars from, Alaska. But I don't think there's much use of these cedars for cedar shakes now that are of Atlantic white cedar, but at one time, again, it was very, very important. Well, what are the threats? Fortunately, due to the existence of protected wetland laws and the fact that most of these are preserved land, the fact that being grossly disturbed is not very likely. But these swamps can be affected by more subtle threats of changes in hydrology, water chemistry, invasive species, concerned about, and of course, the mother of all threats, global climate change. And that's it. And I'd just like to, again, thank those folks that provided me some information for that presentation. I think we're pretty much right on time, but maybe one question, or anybody, if any has a comment or question? If not, yeah.
Why would you not, why would repatriating, try to get that stay on Plum Island?
Yeah.
What would the negative be to try to get that going? Taking some of those seedlings into planting?
I don't think there would be any, but I think we'd have to try to, you don't want it to be a futile effort. I think we try to best understand what the hydrology was, what the environmental conditions were there to try to more likely guarantee success. But I think it is something that's worthwhile. And you know what? Again, Matt talked about management of Plum Island, some issues. If we're fortunate enough down the road to get that as a refuge, guess what? One of the things that we'd like to interact with the refuge staff or the Fish and Wildlife Service about their habitat unit would be, maybe we should think about trying to restore a white cedar population there, yeah.